Okay. And something I learned from my first interview was ask the person to introduce themselves. Would you would you be able to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Bruce Dietzen, and people probably know me most for making a hemp-bodied sports car. Um, and I've been a hemp advocate since 2014, when I was inspired by an article I read in The Emperor Wears No Clothes about Henry Ford creating a car um, that was about 50% plant material, and including hemp and other plant materials. And that was my inspiration because even though he wasn't thinking about carbon, um, his solution was very much aligned with addressing the current climate crisis. Even though he didn't even know about it, his motivation was completely different. So that's what got me into it. And when I realized that the car that I was making was probably a next generation, a little better performing version of hemp. I don't know if you can see this. This is my latest creation here, but much thinner than what Henry Ford had. This one's thinner than what I used on my car.
So it almost looks like from that angle and from the camera, it almost look like an acrylic.
Yeah, I don't know. This stupid background thing is, let me get rid of that. I was just experimenting with.
I love it. It's very Matrix-esque.
There we go. Yeah, I always wanted to find out if you could put GIFs on these things, but I couldn't find any GIFs.
I love it.
So that one, I'm going to get rid of that one. But anyway, this is an example of a next generation panel. It just doesn't like that. So
there we go. That's it.
Here you can see it's all these unidirectional hemp fibers or yarns.
Wow.
that don't go above each other and below each other like a regular textile weave. Instead, they all go very straight, and that increases the stiffness of the thing. So net, this is about 30%, 40% thinner than the body of the car that I made. I actually made two cars.
Okay, interesting.
One got a little better, and this is the next generation. So making it, just dropping the weight even more, and
wow,
using bioplastics. Anyway, that's what got me into hemp, was actually doing a back of the napkin calculation on what the carbon footprint of what his car would have been and what mine was.
Yeah.
And I ran biofuels in it, just like Henry Ford did back in 1941. And then was able to calculate roughly what the lifetime carbon footprint of that car would be. And it turned out to be much less than today's electric vehicles.
Wow. Yeah.
Not that I'm against the electric vehicles. I think that's the way to go. But it's tough to get the petroleum companies to do the right thing. So electric vehicles are the only thing that's really viable right now. So, but net, I would love to eventually see hemp-bodied cars and hemp plastic using throughout the cars, etc. Henry Ford's car was again 50% plant-based, and the only thing that was steel was the suspension and the wheels and the engine and transmission drivetrain.
What do you feel were his motivations then for exploring that material?
His motivations were really clear. They were coming out of, the United States was coming out of being in a situation where they had a surplus of agricultural crops, because they really ramped up to feed Europe during World War I. And when the war ended, the demand dropped off dramatically. And so Ford's idea was, well, why don't we just, we ran into this huge shortage during World War I. um, steel and other types of materials, and even wood. And so why don't we simply make everything out of crop materials, crop residues, even better. So he went on this whole jag, and he thought that soybean was the answer to everything. So he had a soup made out of soybean. He had soybean ice cream. He had all these events that he would launch, that he would make all these dinners for people and dignitaries out of soybeans. It probably tasted pretty bad. I don't know back in those days, but that was his whole thing was, let's try to figure out how to use plants to a greater degree to keep the American farmers healthy, financially. So that was his shtick. But now you take a look at the world where we're at right now with climate crisis, and you simply recognize, plants, every plant on the planet is 45% carbon that's derived from the atmosphere. And so, gosh, if we can make everything out of plant materials, that would reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. In fact, if we could take, I think it's 100 billion tons of materials are made every year around the world. If we could take and make all of those materials, which isn't possible, but theoretically, if we could take all those materials and switch them over to plant-based materials, that within 10 years, the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere would go from 420, where it is right now, back to 280. And we would be back at a level that was pre-industrial revolution. And voila, most of our problems would be solved, but not all, obviously. We've already hit some tipping points, with 3% of Greenland falling off into the ocean last week, and many other things that are already happening. So, but net, we really need to take a look at this idea of using plant materials to make the products that we consume, products, but also fuels and this sort of thing too.
Yeah.
So we have to take a look at that very differently. And so that's what I'm working on right now, is a book that explains all of that. So
fantastic. That sounds amazing and so needed. And so from your early research then, I'd love to swing back to the cars, but actually in terms of what you're researching specifically on, is it drawdown hemp or project hemp drawdown or drawdown hemp? What have been the most impactful things that you're discovering? Because I mean, one of my early impressions before having this conversation and doing a little bit more research was actually that hempcrete would be a really big one, and the construction industry could really benefit from that sort of usage of hemp. But actually, what are the things that you found from your continued research into this?
I'm glad you brought up the idea of hempcrete. That was my assumption too when we first started. When I founded Drawdown Hemp, which is now, we changed the name. Project Drawdown didn't like us using the word drawdown, right? So fine, I sent him a message and said, yeah, we will honor your request. So we changed our name to Hemp CO2 Lective, which that's the way it's spelled, but it's the way you pronounce it is Hemp Collective. It's a little confusing, but it gets the idea. But net, when we first started out, we just assumed that hempcrete was probably going to be the big one. That was going to be granddaddy. And just a month or so after we started Drawdown Hemp with the objective to quantify how much CO2 could be CO2 and CO2e could be sequestered or avoided. We wanted to measure both, right? There's huge impacts for doing both, right? And I can explain that if you want me to, but
I would love to further understand that as well. But I mean, from listening to what you were bringing around the X Prize as well. And
X Prize, the X Prize contest, which is still going on, specified specifically that they were only interested in solutions that could sequester a gigaton or more of CO2 per year. And hempcrete does sequester CO2, right? And it locks it away for over 100 years if the house is going to last for over 100 years, so it qualifies for that. But the X price did not allow teams to calculate in carbon avoidance. They considered that a cherry on top. So if you could figure out a solution that would do 1 gigaton per year, then you could qualify to go on to the next phase. So we did qualify, but early on we found out that just running the numbers that hempcrete, because it's mixed with lime, right, has you have to calculate the embodied carbon of that product, which is like 1 part hemp herds to 1.5 parts lime, measured in weight, right? Not in volume, but in weight. And that's the most important part. So net, you end up with for every ton of hempcrete that's used, if it were all just hemp, it would sequester 1.38, and we eventually came to that number looking at several different scientific studies that argued it back and forth. It ranged all the way from 1.67 down to 1.15, and it seems like there was a kind of a consensus on about 1.38. But once you mix in the lime in there, which is not as bad as Portland cement, but it's still pretty carbon intensive, it drops it down, the combination, to only about a negative 0.24 tons. So net, by the time we calculated it all out, if you built every single home and building and high rise around the world, our guesstimate, even though it was very tough to get the data on this really solid, was way short of a gigaton per year. So even went and reviewed that with U.S. Hemp Building Association, the new director there, and he's an engineer, and he says, you're right. It only took him, I worked on it for a long time to get the numbers really solid, and it only took about 15 minutes to look at it. Says, I think you're right. There's no way. And they were gonna pursue the X prize too, and they decided at that point that they wouldn't, because they were going towards hempcrete, and so I'm a big advocate for hempcrete, still am. And if you actually take some of these new products that are coming out, these alternative binders, there's one called VICAT, which we're looking at. It's a carbon negative binder replacement for Portland cement. And they say when you're making concrete with this, that the concrete's going to end up being, well, maybe they're talking about this, the binder itself, but there's not much difference when you calculate in the sand and the gravel, the aggregate, but somewhere in the neighborhood about 0.3 gigaton, or 0.3 tons for every ton, negative 0.3 tons for every ton that's used. So it's carbon negative concrete. So that's interesting. So they're pushing towards the concrete industry, which is a great idea to get them to the point where they're carbon negative, barely carbon negative, 0.3. Yeah. But the real big opportunity, right, is if we go back now and revisit the whole thing, we say, okay, let's again look at all the homes in the world. And we have to do this on a big scale because we're in trouble, right? Humanity is. We have to. This isn't just pie in the sky. Somebody really needs to be thinking about making an edict, almost a martial law, but definitely a mobilization in order to address the climate crisis and starting to produce products that are carbon negative. That's the bottom line. Yeah. But if you were to use something like this VICAT, and there's other ones that are emerging, then now you're carbon negative. Now you go from negative 0.24 per ton of hempcrete with lime mixed into it. That number changes now to negative 1.84, right? So now you're almost sequestered for every ton of hempcrete that you're making using these new binders, these carbon negative binders, you can actually be sequestering almost 2 tons of CO2. That makes a big difference, but still it doesn't get you to the point where it's a gigaton per year. There are other places where it can be a gigaton per year. If you look at in terms of again, this mobilization concept, right? In 1941, FDR mobilized the country to enter into World War II, and did an incredible job with the help of several guys that used to work at Ford, and the main names escape me right now, but the whole mass production concept was really perfected at Ford, and then moved over to General Motors, et cetera, was applied to making all these bombers and machine guns and Jeeps, et cetera. And that's where we're going to have to go. I'm going to say it here. It's an inevitable. We have to mobilize for the climate crisis. And I'm not the only one that's saying that. So, but that's what's going to have to happen. So we've got to find solutions that are a gigaton or more, not only in sequestration, but also carbon avoidance. And as I alluded to, the carbon avoidance just means, okay, we're going to instead of burning coal, right? We're going to put these windmills out there, wind turbines, and solar panels, and we're going to avoid having to burn coal. So that's a big number, right?
Yeah.
And so that plays this in the same way with things like fuels. So instead of burning gasoline, petroleum-based gasoline, we could be burning fuels that are made from industrial hemp scraps, or soybean scraps, or corn scraps. Pretty much any agricultural residue can be used to make biofuels, and it's effectively carbon neutral, right? So that's carbon avoidance. So, but you would ask where other areas where we found big opportunities with hemp. If you put your mindset into this concept of mobilization, right, where the entire country, and not just the entire country, but the entire planet gets behind this, this idea of making everything from carbon negative materials in order to address the climate crisis. And they change everything and just say, shit, we're all going to die unless we do this, right? And we're not far off from that being true. Then you start thinking, okay, what are the big challenges? And one of the big challenges that are there simultaneously with the climate crisis is a food crisis. So if you can use something that's known to be very effective to reinvigorate the croplands around the world, and there's a lot of abandoned croplands around the world, then that makes sense, because we'll have more land to grow food, right? So that's number one. And then you start thinking, okay, well, wait a second, what if we also use that same mysterious material and use it as a rotation crop to reinvigorate and add more carbon to the soil of existing croplands? And that's where biochar starts to fit in. Both those scenarios, you would grow hemp on a massive scale, pyrolyze it, put it back into the soil, etc. And even for regular crops, those as a rotation crop, that works as well, because hemp has the deep roots and breaks up the soils.
Yeah. Could you just explain what pyrolyzing is? I had to Google this earlier, but would you be able to explain what pyrolyzing is and how the process is created?
Yeah. Pyrolyzing is heating up organic material in the absence of oxygen, or very, very little oxygen. So what you end up with is something that looks like charcoal. It's called biochar, though. And it's generally somewhere around 85 to 90, 75 to 95% pure carbon, right? And it's stable at that point. It can't biodegrade and go back into the atmosphere. That carbon is locked away for thousands of years. And so you can just leave it in a pile if you wanted to, right? And it's meeting its objective. But in terms of sequestering CO2, but if you inoculate it with all sorts of good stuff, compost and this sort of thing, or organic fertilizers or what have you, and then you put it into fields, then it slowly releases those things, those nutrients into the croplands, and also helps retain water. So and it creates all these little tiny mini hotels for all the microorganisms, et cetera, required for soil health. So that's where pyrolysis comes in, and it's really getting to be very well recognized around the world right now as a major tool to help with the climate crisis. So there's a lot of other folks that are out there pushing the idea of biochar. We're certainly not the only ones, but it just happens to be that hemp would work out great if we went to all these abandoned croplands and said, okay, for the next X years, we're going to take these things that can't produce anything, and we're going to put in, say, one example is 10 tons of biochar per acre, right? And that could potentially increase the crop yields as much as on those types of lands, as much as 400%. And on the other hand, and so you would actually grow all this hemp right on that location, process it right there, and just move across the world with this huge band of hemp growing. And if we did that over 10-year period, we'd be trying to remember the number. I think for abandoned croplands, that would be somewhere in the neighborhood until we got it all done. I mean, done on a massive scale, because we know the shit's hitting the fan, right? It wouldn't be done just by entrepreneurs saying, oh, I think I need to do this. It would have to be backed by governments around the world. There's no doubt, right? But we subsidized petroleum for a few decades, so why not subsidize saving the planet? So if we did that, then we'd actually sequester somewhere in the neighborhood, a little shy of, I think it was 1.5, maybe 1.3 gigatons per year for a 10-year period. That was a big number. Then you also, now you stay, but thinking some more about other applications in the same light, and you could take, you can combine the upcoming number of desalinization plants that are being put in place around the world, and those could help to irrigate land that's basically desert right now, right? So imagine imagine taking these sand lands that are worthless, right, and turning them into croplands. And the way you would do that, you wouldn't just dick around by growing some carrots and corn and soybeans. You go, full tilt boogie. You'd grow the crop that can yield the one crop, right, that can yield more than any other massive amount of biomass as ultimately a rotation crop. So and you do that on these lands, and you would convert them into productive croplands around the world. Haven't completely calculated all these nuances yet. This is just some new ideas, but just thinking out of the box. How do we address this climate crisis and do it within the next 10 years? Because the IPCC said that, if we don't do something big before 2030, we're going to have all these tipping points, and they could run amok and trigger other events, like the hydrites, etc., melting underneath the seas, and the giant holes in Siberia where the methane has exploded out, et cetera, from the permafrost thawing and this sort of thing. So there are these events that are starting to happen, and we've got to move fast in order to bring the ppm, the carbon dioxide ppm back down. Beautiful. So these are crazy ideas, right? And that's what happens, before things change. People say your ideas are crazy, you're stupid, and it's the same thing they told me back in 2015 when I made a hemp car. Jay Leno is, he was the reason why I got on Jay Leno's garage is because they were looking for people that made crazy, stupid cars, and they were doing a bunch of different shows on that theme, and mine was one of them. But it didn't look stupid, it didn't look crazy. The only thing weird about it was made from cannabis sativa. So and so people got excited about that. But net he thought it was pretty cool. But that's kind of where I'm going with all of this, and trying to show that hemp, once you can show that hemp, you combine the different things that hemp can do, that's really different than, say, direct air capture or carbon capture, utilization, storage, these other technologies that are being developed for addressing the climate crisis that I'm not so sure I'm in love with. Direct air capture, I think it's okay. Carbon capture and utilization and storage, I think, is a total joke. But they're one-trick ponies. These other technologies that are out there, they do one thing and one thing only. Hemp, on the other hand, right? While you're doing all of this, while you're recovering all of these lands and making them productive for food growth, you're simultaneously growing food there, right? You're growing the plant not only for its carbon sequestration capability to leave carbon in the soil through regenerative ag, but you're also using the stalks to make hempcrete houses. You're using some of the bast for probably non-textile applications if you're growing it tall for seed.
Maybe actually, can you just talk people through the parts of a hemp plant? So as you're describing these different parts of the hemp plant, so it's a sort of really easy to understand which bits are doing what thing, because there's, I've heard of hemp bioplastics and all sorts of different things, but I myself have no clue which parts is doing what and how it could sort of support things from it.
Yeah, it's an incredibly versatile plant. I've never been a farmer. I've never planted any hemp, just researched it. But you can grow it for different purposes, and you can switch out, one season to, okay, I've got customers that want textile grade fiber. Yeah. They want to make blue jeans, Patagonia or something like that. Right. So in order to make the very best fiber for textile applications, you only grow it to about 6 feet. And you harvest it before it pollinates. And so that's when you get, like behind me here that you see on this, that's something close to that, not quite. But you plant the individual hemp plants very close together, and so they compete for sunlight, and so their stalks are really only about as thick as your finger, right? And or less. And so what happens there is you don't have a lot of lignin in it. And the fiber is very, very strong at that point. If you let it grow taller and eventually go to seed, this sort of thing, you'll have a lot of hurd as well, but very little hurd if you're just growing it for fiber. When it's grown for fiber, the only thing that's really the value that it's getting is just the fiber, pretty much. There is
what is the hemp hurd?
The hemp hurd is the woody core of the stalk. Okay. So on the outside you have the bast fiber. So when I refer to fiber, that means bast fiber. Sorry, and that's what you would make stuff like this from, right? So you're using that bast fiber. That's the highest quality long fiber that's coming off the plant.
Okay.
And then the herd is kind of the woody sort of stuff. It's like balsa wood on the inside. And that's what's the herd is what's used for hempcrete. So, a farmer can terminate his crop, at 60 days and get really high quality fiber, or grow it longer. And he usually is going to make his decision beforehand. It's not going to like wake up in the morning and say, yeah, I think I'll cut it for fiber right now. You're going to have off takes before you plant it, hopefully, right? As any good farmer would. So it could also be grown for the herd. And at that point, the fiber, the bast fiber, gets really, really tough, and it's got a lot of lignin in it, and it's not nearly as strong, and it's harder to process, et cetera. But you've got a lot of herd, and so you can use that herd now to make a lot of biochar, or to make hempcrete, right? Or foams for industrial applications, et cetera. So there's a lot of different applications in there. But now once you're into that scenario, you're also able to harvest the grain that comes off of this. So getting back to the original premise that we need to address this looming food crisis, worldwide food crisis, right? The last thing you want to do if you're posing a solution to a food crisis is to take up all the land around the world with something that doesn't feed people. Well, hemp does feed people, right? And it's far more nutritious than say corn, even though your corn yields are going to be, I think, like something 9 times higher in weight for an acre of corn than an acre of hemp seed, which is called grain if it's used for eating as opposed to planting. Same thing, but it's grain, so that's what you're feeding people with. But it's far more nutritious than corn, right? I mean, corn is what is one of the reasons why we've got such fat people here in the United States, right? It's that's where all this sucrose comes in, and it's put into processed foods, and so it ends up not being very good for you. But on the other hand, you can get more protein and your omegas from hemp seed than you can from a cheeseburger, right? For beef or chicken or anything like that. So a third way, big way to avoid CO2 is something that I think is also going to be an inevitable, and that is to dramatically cut back on eating meat and dairy, especially cheese. So as much as all of us love that stuff, it's just not a sustainable model. And I know there's going to be a lot of people that scream that we can't do that, but bottom line, I can't remember exactly what the number is, but a huge portion of the croplands that are grown today around the world, especially in the West, in America, is for feeding livestock, and then a lot of it is for ethanol, for corn for ethanol. And both of those things, if they went away, the ethanol is going to go away to a good degree with electric vehicles. But if we stopped eating beef right around the world today, that would avoid 1.5 gigatons per year and would free up massive amounts of croplands. And so if you're adding croplands by growing hemp in abandoned croplands and rejuvenating those so that they can be 4 times more productive than they used to be, that's a huge thing. And then if you start to replace all of this beef and chicken and pigs and all this kind of stuff with a better source of protein, right? It's a magical formula. And so now you're starting to talk about well over 2, maybe as much as 5 gigatons per year. And I don't think there's anything else out there that can be executed right now. If you were the president, Joseph, right now, or the prime minister, and you had the ability to say, wow, we've got to do something. We have to do something now before 2030, and it has to be big. This is something that we're basically putting onto your table and say, Joseph, here's an opportunity to do anywhere from 2 to 5 gigatons per year of sequestration and avoidance. Do you want to save the planet, or do you want to sit on your butt? So that's the opportunity that we have.
It's challenging to be placed in that position of having to sort of create that decision. I mean, there's so many people advocating for all these sort of lifestyles and ways of living, but you can also see the interactions that the animals have within their environments as well, and the fact that we've separated land masses and sort of slowed down those migratory patterns and things like that. It's actually sort of impacted, though, because there's a lot of carbon in the pedosphere already, right? We kind of need those interactions of animals as well. So that, more on that sort of rewilding project type of thing. You can sort of almost see where and how certain animals, like pigs, for instance, will truffle and stuff in the land. And actually, that allows then seeds or trees or whatever to grow there much more easily. So there's a greater carbon sort of sequestration in that area. So you can sort of see the benefits of having those animals in there in the environment as well. But I agree in terms of the way and the industrialization and production of it, in terms of how it's required, I totally agree with you. It just doesn't function that well, and switching out most proteins for something that like that, while still allowing animals to live and have an existence, I quite like that idea of it being sort of more integrated like that, for sure.
Yeah, and I'm just putting the numbers out there. I'm not saying we should stop eating all animals. I'm just putting the numbers out there, just saying let's get that, consider, because there's plenty of other great contributions that the livestock industry brings. It does create a lot of great compost, organic compost, etc. But there's trade-offs. But one thing that's really interesting about the whole idea of pushing the hemp grain production is, there's most of the countries around the world can't afford the idea of taking whatever it is, 30 or 40% of their croplands and dedicating it to feeding their livestock. That's, to them, they just go, we are already poor. We can't waste that much money, that resource on raising cows. It's just out of the question. So they don't, and that's the reason why you don't see massive amounts of, you don't see people in some of these poorer countries enjoying a cheeseburgers or something like that. Whatever they can grow, they use their land to grow. So this would actually give these poorer countries a steady supply of nutritious food, right? That they could also use the rest of the plant from the stalk to make their homes, right? And they would do it on their own terms in their own country, right? And so they're not dependent upon some other rich country selling them 2x4s or selling them cement or what have you. They can do it in a sustainable way and be self-reliant. And so this concept is,
and maybe even innovate and sell back to the rich countries themselves. That's sort of equal.
They not necessarily sell back to the rich countries. I mean, there would be trade, but if you did this across the world, theoretically, every country would be using hemp for one of their mainstays for food and for all their building materials. It'd be kind of like across the board. Well, what are we having tonight, hon? We're going to have some hemp grain again, and we'll have it in the kitchen over there, the hempcrete kitchen. Let's sit around the table, and everybody would do that. So it's a carbon negative way to do it, but it levels the playing field, right? So right now, if you go into most of the countries around the world, we live in an extractive society, and so whoever has the banks behind them can finance the extraction of the raw materials to make aluminum. And then so the jobs are, swinging a pick and loading a wheelbarrow in that country to fill up, these containers with bauxite or whatever it is that's used. And the same thing with gold or diamonds or what have you. It's an extractive society. Same thing with oil, right? And natural gas.
Lithium as well. I mean, like even this EV solution has its issues as well. So lithium mining, for instance, is still an extractive industry. It still kind of takes from the land. Still means we can't do anything on the land, and we'll have to have some form of remediation to repair that land after it's kind of been used as well. And just to swing it back a little bit to cars as well, in terms of hemp's products and the opportunities there to integrate it into the automotive industry. I mean, something that came up for me is I like the idea of upcycling and making sure, making use of what we've got currently and then reducing what we need kind of on top. But sort of battery cases is really needed at the minute for EV upcycling projects, for instance. And actually, I wanted to ask you if you feel like hemp has those, capabilities to function as like a steel box would at the minute in terms of insulating, protecting from water, from air and water being able to get through into those battery sort of containers. Do you feel from this research and this project that you've done in terms of creating your own car body entirely from hemp, did you spot any other parts of the car as well that you thought this would also make sense if it was easier to access or do? What was your experience there?
Well, there's hemp can be used in a bunch of different types of hemp plastics. Can be used in the automotive industry. This example that I showed you is the highest performance application, right? See, that's what you might make the body out of, right? Where it needs to be as light as possible and as strong as possible. It's a more labor intensive, or it could be automated. Obviously, that's not a problem, and roboticized. But it takes longer to do something like this. It's a little more expensive. But on the other hand, you've got a whole bunch of small parts on automobiles that can be made from injection molding, right? So those can be made from a combination. Right now, it's the hemp's not a perfect solution in that area. Most of the hemp plastics that are out there are really just replacing anywhere from 20 to 25% of the petroleum-based compounds that go into injection molding. But it's a good start, right? It's 25% reduction in petroleum is good. But ultimately, that the stuff that goes in that's made from injection molding is not as strong as the body would be. It doesn't need to be, and it can be produced faster. So you've got just about anything that's plastic on a car, and I think right now something like more than 25% of the materials in cars are plastic. Could use this type of hemp plastic that's the smaller little bits of hurd, right, that are ground up and compounded with whatever the material might be, whether it's PET or ABS, the various different types of plastics, maybe even PHA or PLA, which are compostable. So, but I think we're going to see even better plastics, more environmentally friendly plastics in the future. But the jury's still out about how, what's supposedly good and what's bad. Some people say you need to have biodegradable plastics, and others will say, no, what you need to do is just reduce the amount of types of plastics and just force it down to there's only one or two or three types of plastics that you can use. And we are now going to get serious about recycling these, so they don't go and end up in dumps, but they get reused in different types of products.
Interesting. And just in terms of thinking, replacing even bigger things like the chassis and the axles, do you ever perceive that there's possible products and strength of materials that could come from hemp that could replace those more steel parts as well?
theoretically, I would guess that it probably is possible, but realistically, I and I've seen stories about a guy who made engine blocks, as an example, out of ABS plastic, right? And that's pretty cool. Really light. But it's still petroleum based. ABS is plastic is petroleum based, so it is possible. But in reality, I don't think that hemp or other plant-based materials will replace all of these other materials. The metals can replace a lot of them, a lot. And I don't think that all concrete will eventually be replaced by hemp either. You still need to have load-bearing capabilities, and hemp doesn't have that. Hempcrete doesn't have load-bearing capabilities to speak of. So we've got, but the idea is you got to get the leaders of the world have to get their mindset into this space, and that's called, how do we go carbon negative to the greatest degree possible? And we won't be able to do it for everything, but it should be the exception to the rule. So when Henry Ford did his car he started in 1929. It took him 12 years. He went through, it's like his private lab. This was his ultimate experiment, his ultimate invention in his mind. Was a car that was made with as much as many materials as possible that came off the farm. That was the edict. If you could not replace something on the car with something that came off the farm, either you had to have a real good excuse to Henry Ford, or you're going to get your ass fired. So that's how it turned out that he ended up having a 50% made out of plant material, and we could do that today with automobiles and other vehicles, etc.
What were the challenges that you faced actually in terms of doing that for yourself with the body panels of the Renew car?
What were the challenges?
Yeah. In terms of how we could sort of go from your model to a more industrialized process of that, what do you feel the challenges are currently?
Well, the biggest challenge if we're talking just for the automotive industry, although it may bleed into other applications as well, is that the automotive industry is extremely cost conscious, right? They will turn down one potential vendor versus another vendor for $1 billion of material over 20 cents difference in the price. It's just, they're that tight with the buck. So any new technology or different technology, I should say, that comes on the scene is going to be more expensive, at least for a period of time. And trying to go up with go head to head with certain carbon intensive materials like steel is very difficult from a cost perspective, because steel is dirt cheap. It's dirt cheap. So is concrete. So, you come in and you say, well, we're going to replace all these concrete buildings that we were going to build. We're going to make them out of hempcrete instead. Well, it's going to cost you at least 20% more to do that. And so there you have to have these incentives. Again, getting back to the government has to step in, right, and say, okay, we have to do this. It's just, if we don't, we're going to have one catastrophe after another. So it's what has to happen. And somebody's probably going to watch this recording in 20 years and go, he was right, we didn't do it, we're screwed now. So that's really where we're at. So that's the biggest problem is getting companies, not just automobile companies, but anybody that manufactures anything, to say, all right, I'm willing to pay the extra price in order to make it carbon negative, right? So instead, what these companies are doing is they're going along with this BS that the fossil fuel industry is talking about, And the term is net zero. That's their baby. They created this net zero concept, and it's bupkis. It's BS. It's a stalling tactic for the fossil fuel industries to keep on doing what they're doing for a longer time. And they say that we've got this window by 2050. All these corporations, and so you have major corporations, respectable corporations that are out there saying, well, yeah, we'll go, maybe we'll consider this concept of being carbon neutral. They don't even talk about very few talk about going carbon negative, which is totally different, much different mentality. And the way we're going to slowly get there is to buy carbon credits, right? So they aren't taking responsibility for their products. Right, they're still using massive amounts of fossil fuels in order to make the steel, or to make the fiberglass, or to make the carbon fiber, and those materials are hugely more carbon intensive than steel.
Did you look at the figures for car, a typical car, in terms of what the emissions are in terms of carbon, specifically including all of those parts and the sources and the transportation on average?
Yeah.
I know it's hard to average out, but did you look at some of that?
Oh yeah. So your average internal combustion engine automobile right now on a worldwide basis has the production of that vehicle dumps about 5.6 tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, just producing the vehicle. And now when you fuel it with gasoline or diesel, gasoline's going to be more, but on average, it's a lifetime carbon footprint of about 74 tons. Okay. Right. So an EV, so that's a lot, right? Yeah. And the main savings is going to be, okay, let's make that powered by electricity instead of fuel. Boom, your lifetime carbon footprint goes down dramatically. So it's right around 8 to 10 tons of CO2 that are required, that are dumped in the atmosphere for every EV that's made right now. That's a big dramatic. It's 7 times reduction in lifetime carbon footprint. And what I calculated about Henry Ford's car, and then the car that I made, which I try to pretty much use the same kind of a rough formula, that was probably about 3 tons lifetime, if it was burning biofuels, right? Which are effectively carbon neutral, or could be carbon neutral. You always have to look at these things in 2 different ways. Either you take a look at what the scope 2 and scope 3 emissions are going to be in today's world, or you look at it, what could they be if we did this whole mobilization and everybody's making biofuels, and fossil fuels are no more. So that's the best case scenario.
So this is good. I mean, and that's another dramatic shift. So from 70 to 8 roughly, and then from 8 to 3 just from the hemp paneling alone.
Not just from the hemp paneling, but from the fuels too. So yeah. And when I first did the car, I thought, this is great. I've got a car here. If we burn, cellulosic ethanol made from agricultural residues. That's what Henry Ford did. His car in 1941 was run on residues, and some say that those residues came from hemp fields. Could be, we don't know for sure. But net the fuel is still fundamentally almost carbon neutral. It's according to a study, Michael Wong in 2011, I think it was, said that it's a reduction. If you use the biofuels to actually do your processing and of your actual feedstocks, et cetera, and turning them into biofuels, then you're actually reducing the overall carbon footprint of the fuel by 80, I think it was 85 or 87%. So it's not quite carbon neutral, but that you add it all up and you ended up. And I thought, wow, that's the mecca. That's,
Mm,
wow, this is cool. Who could, I've actually created a car that if we fueled it the way that Henry Ford was fueling his, is
mm,
greener than the Tesla. And I was
mm.
all excited and I thought this is the ultimate, but I was wrong. Um, then there was this company called Blue Planet that came out and started to talk about what they were doing in around 2015. And their whole thing was to use this pyrolysis process that we were talking about, right? In order to make fuels instead of using a fermentation process, right? Which Henry Ford used to make cellulosic ethanol. So instead, these guys were taking the same crop residues and they would put them into these kilns without any oxygen in them, heat them up, and the gas that they would give off is called syngas, and that can be turned into methanol, and methanol can then be turned into gasoline, right? And they did that successfully, and they even had it tested. They sent it off to labs where they had it carbon dated, and the scientists in the labs, called them back. This is an interesting story. He said, this is not possible. We're doing the carbon dating on your fuel, and it shows that it's only a couple of weeks old. There's no such thing as fuel that has carbon in it that's only a few weeks old. So it's they're used to seeing fossil fuels that from millions of years ago, and so you carbon date that the fuels, and it's just, oh yeah, this is definitely from the dinosaur period, So, but here's the thing that was cool about this fuel. Is that because it was made from a pyrolysis process, they had a byproduct of biochar. But nobody really knew what they could do with biochar back in 2015. It's only caught on over the last 3 years, right? In a big way. And it's big. There's a lot of people that are talking about that in the climate space right now. Biochar is really getting serious attention. And so a big oil company came in and bought up a big part of that company and said, we don't like, I'm guessing this at this point, but they pretty much put the brakes on the idea of what effectively was being promoted as a carbon negative fuel.
Mm,
Imagine carbon negative fuel,
mm,
right? So where every mile you're driving, right, it's actually there's a byproduct that's generated back at the distillery, right, or refinery, that gets plowed back into the soils, and it's sequestered CO2. So I did the calculations on that, and the lifetime carbon footprint of a car like that could potentially have been negative 100 tons.
wow.
Yeah. Now that's going carbon negative, but they stopped that in 2015, and the oil companies did, and they said, we don't know too much about this biochar, but you guys keep on making biochar and go out there and sell that. And if you do, we'll all make money together, but don't be pushing this carbon negative fuel concept. And so they did, and now they've been very successful at doing that. But it could be that we cycle around, and again, you'll see the advent of a carbon negative fuel, because we're going to need liquid fuels to some degree, right? And probably much less than we do today, but those fuels in the future could be carbon negative, and that's going to blow everybody's mind. So, but it's interesting that the petroleum companies could have been making carbon negative fuel since 2015. We wouldn't be in, they could have switched the whole thing over. They could have gone to the governments and said, look, we think we've got this problem called climate crisis. We're just calling it global warming now, but in 5 years, we're going to be calling it a climate crisis. So according to our scientists, so we've got this idea, we have a way to make carbon negative fuel. Could you subsidize that instead of petroleum? Well, sure. But that conversation never happened, probably.
Sure. What do you feel would be the inspiration, and what can people do in terms of people who are listening to this conversation? What do you feel the most impactful actions that we can take? Is it demanding carbon negative products, or how
Yes. Yes.
carbon negative body panels for cars, if we're looking to do that specifically? Like, what are the action steps that you would recommend?
Well, I don't look at it as much as, take a look at one product or something like that and say, okay, everybody go out and buy that one type of product or something. But that's a great question, is what can the average person do to move things forward?
Yeah.
And my first answer to that is, number one, if you don't understand what carbon negative is, start to do some research on it. You need to understand what going carbon negative. We're, as a society, humanity, it's inevitable. We are going to go carbon negative. Nobody's talking about it right now, but everybody will be in 5 years. Everybody will know what being carbon negative is. I've been talking about it since 2015, and it's just starting to get some traction. So what the average person can do is be aware that that's where we have to go. And we have to make as much stuff as we can out of carbon negative materials. That's that's perhaps the biggest way that we can address the climate crisis. So we need to, as individuals, we need to vote out of office any politicians that don't stand up and say, I am no longer taking any contributions from the fossil fuel industry, right? They need to all stand up there and say, I'm not going to take any money from those guys. Instead, I will take contributions from green industries, etc. Right? And that could be a movement. And we need to get rid of the politicians that are on the dole from the fossil fuel industries. Fossil fuel industries are not going to go out quietly. They are the most wealthy corporations in the world. They have incredible amounts of lobbying power in the world governments right now. And if you think they're just going to say, oh, well, yeah, we understand we're creating a problem, they're not. Instead, they're going to come up with things like carbon capture, utilization, and storage. They've been pushing that technology, and all that is a continuation of the same concept. Only they're saying that they're going to, add on, extra components to their fuel burning processes that will capture the CO2. But they've had 10 years to do it, and they haven't. Their execution is less than 0.5% of what they said that they would do. So they're full of BS, and they don't really give a shit, and they don't give a shit about you. So we have to, as citizens, we have to get rid of all politicians that are in their back pocket, and then we've got something, right? Sure. So we've got people that are making the decisions based upon the future of the planet versus whether or not they get money to be reelected from the fossil fuel industries. That's the big one in my mind. Okay. I'll probably come up with more, but I think that's, obviously, in the future, we're going to have more and more of our products that are out there with labels that show their carbon footprint. Unilever is one of these companies that has pledged that in the next 10 years, you know how you buy something right now and it shows you how many calories are on the thing that you're about to eat, but the same sort of thing is going to happen with all of their products, and they have like thousands of products. One of the most diverse corporations on the planet. They make all sorts of things, and they're going to put it right on the side what the carbon impact is for that product. So that'll give the consumer an opportunity to look at it and say, oh, this is this price, this is this price, this one's carbon negative, this one's incredibly carbon positive. And we already know that consumers will buy the carbon, the reduced carbon products if there's not a huge difference in the price. If it's the same price, we know that they'll do that. So the other thing is to vote with their dollars.
To support those products that are already out there, and then if they're thinking, or they're thinking of creating something themselves as well, just to think in terms of that entire process, ensure that every single step of that journey is carbon negative.
Yeah.
Aware of all of the cycle. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Wow. Bruce, thank you so much for your wisdom and experience. It's been, yeah, truly an enlightening conversation. I feel like I've learned an awful lot.
My pleasure.
Yeah, really appreciate it.
So tell me a little bit more about yourself. I've spoken enough.
Sure.
And what you're doing.
Sure. I mean, I was looking quite heavily into different conservation projects that I could support, or figuring out different business models that would support them. And the first thing I looked at was travel. That was my background as well. And trying to bring a sort of more regenerative travel industry, or create a more regenerative travel industry. There's a challenge, of course, with getting to these places. Can be impactful. Obviously, you need to weigh up the experiences and the connections and the connection to nature and people that you might get from these different places versus the emissions from traveling there. But I found that a lot of it just relied on flying for the moment, which is seemingly quite a challenging thing to reduce in terms of emissions as well. So I started exploring different things, and upcycling cars just seemed to come about as a concept, as something that people are already doing as well. Obviously, because you don't need to create new products to use what we've already got, and then transitioning the fuel source away from fossil fuel to EV as one idea or option. But like you said, if there's a carbon negative fuel, then I'm all for that, and I'm all for encouraging that. It's whatever's going to make it easy and scalable, and something that more and more people can do themselves and be empowered to do. So something that I'd like to do is empower knowledge and community around these different things. So it makes it easier for small garages to do the conversion processes and to upcycle cars, and to just really focus on a tiny little portion of it, because I know that this is a huge problem. There's so much there in terms of agriculture, the soil systems, and there's so many different people focusing on so many different things that I thought I'd just follow that intuitive hit and just explore this avenue. And that's what I'm doing at the minute, just talking to different people who've done incredible things and have already started on this journey, and seeing how I can share their wisdom with more people.
Awesome. Well, I'm always available if you want to chat. So
I really appreciate that, Bruce.
Sure.
And keep up the incredible work that you're doing, and these figures, and the research that you're doing with not the Drawdown Project, the
Hemp Collective.
Hemp Collective project.
Hemp Collective. Yeah.
That sounds like it's going to be super pivotal in terms of creating that clarity around what the impact is. And I feel, your intuition and your hit is right there in terms of that those figures then empowering those decision makers, or the people, to then request decision. This is what we want, and this is why. So thank you for continuing to do that. If anybody wants to contribute to that or support that cause, is that open to other people as well?
Is what open to what?
If anybody wants to support with their knowledge or wisdom or whatever, whoever might be listening to this, that could potentially support that.
Yeah, sure. If you're interested, there's a way to communicate with us by just visiting hemp CO2 LLECTIVE.org. So hemp co2 elect Hemp Collective.org. Put a 2 after the CO first. So that's there's a way to communicate it, and then you can actually join up and participate if you're interested.
Beautiful. Yeah, I've got some friends who are sort of keen on this, and my friend Ed in fact highlighted hemp to me as a product and potential.
Great. Cool.
So thank you so much for your time again, Bruce.
Thank you, Joseph. Have a great evening.
You too.
Take care.